So the super keyword is essentially interesting because it can allow you to call um, any given constructor within a parent class. Now, a parent class can also sometimes be called a super class, right? And when we type super, when we type the super method, essentially what happens is it goes to the parent class, the super class, and it sort of retrieves from there the constructor which is used in the class. Now, it doesn't just grab any constructor. It only sort of grabs the constructor which sort of matters to it, right? And so what I'm going to show here, so if you weren't sort of tuning in from the last video, we have a class, right? So B extends A. B is our parent class here. So this is why I've sort of said that the constructor will sort of enclose a print line which will say inside parent constructor. So this is sort of the super class, right? So we can call this, I mean, calling it parent and calling it super is essentially the same thing, right? So parent class or super class. We could call them, I mean, both of these terms are sort of synonymous with each other, right? Um, and so B extends A. And so what we found here is that if B extends A, and so creating this object would essentially, we would think that this is going to call this constructor, right? Because that's the constructor which is sort of explicitly stated here. And so it goes to the class and then from which the object is derived, and then it prints out what is inside the constructor. But that's not what happens. What happens is it goes to the, since B extends A, it actually first, I mean, it does that, but first it prints out what's inside the constructor for the superclass. So the superclass really has precedence here. So if we actually print this out, we say we see that it's inside parent constructor first. That is to say, it's first retrieving the constructor from A, then and only then is it printing out in the constructor for B. So the superclass really has precedence. So just carrying that sort of that thought through, recall that we can actually have overloaded constructors, right? So instead of sort of having a default constructor like we had here, um, what we can do is we can say, okay, int x, right? And so this constructor, essentially we're overloading our constructors at this point. Um, we're going to overload this, and it's going to take in a parameter which is x. And at this point, what's going to happen is we're sort of going to print out what the user enters for x. Now, x is just a placeholder for what the user would eventually enter, but we're going to say inside inside single param constructor, right? And we're also going to say the value of x is essentially just x, right? Okay. And I mean, that's just really, okay, so that's essentially just one case we could have in terms of overloading. So we have no parameters, right? We have one parameter. We could also have another constructor which essentially takes in two parameters, right? So we could have int x, and we could also have int j. And that can essentially be, we can sort of type inside double param constructor, okay? And we can actually print out both of these values here. We can say that we can say the value of x and j are x, and of course with a space, j. So essentially I've made these three overloaded constructors here in the class, in the super class. And here, I mean, so now what is it going to do? It's essentially, I mean, if we print this out, um, we should essentially get the same thing, right? Because it's sort of calling the default one, and inside the default one, whatever's inside the default one is going to get run first, and then whatever's inside the default one for B is going to get run second. But you'll notice if we call super, okay, if we call super, what happens? Well, the same thing happens, right? Because we're essentially referring, so this one just grabs the default constructor. So we get the same outcome. But if we grab this constructor, the single parameter constructor, we'll actually get what's inside here. So but how do we grab that? Well, we just say super, and then we load this super method with the parameters which are sort of inside a here, or the single parameter method, and that's going to signify that we're actually inside the single parameter method. So it's taking in a variable, an integer variable. So in that place, we could say 10, and now it's going to grab this one, okay, instead of the default constructor. And so it grabs inside the value inside single parameter constructor, and it essentially just prints out what was inside that block of code. Then it prints out what's inside this constructor, inside the child constructor. And again, we could just as easily grab the this particular constructor where we're actually loading in two values, right? We're overloading. That's really the point. And then we could say, so not only do we have 10, but we could also have 20. And then it just prints out what's inside that constructor. And so super, I mean, we just do super here, and what we do is we sort of signify which constructor we want to grab by actually making our parameters match what we'd want on the super level, right? Now, an interesting thing to note is that the super method, I mean, this is valid, right? But if we were to sort of do it this way, um, this is actually not allowed, right? So super actually always has to be the first line in a constructor. So that's the only way we could actually have that apply to our program.